Good afternoon, everyone. This is David Boehm from the AACC, Senior Vice President for Public Purpose and National Advocacy. I'm joined here by my colleagues Jim Hermes and Catherine Gimboris. You have heard from them, all of us before, and we thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to be talking both about some of the legislative issues we've been working on, as well as a number of very important regulatory items at the Departments of Labor and Department of Education. I want to thank everybody for being with us. And without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jim to talk about this year's funding odyssey, to use a movie of the season. Jim, please.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks very much to all of you for joining us this afternoon. The two things are really kind of the two main stories that are going on with federal funding right now. One is that before leaving for their annual August recess, both chambers of Congress each passed their own version of a continuing resolution that would keep the government funded at current year funding levels into the next fiscal year. And as a reminder, the federal fiscal year starts on October 1st, so it's FY27 is coming up real quickly. As I mentioned, they are different versions, so they're not identical. So these haven't been enacted yet. And the House version is what we call here a very clean version of CR. Doesn't have really much else in it except for a simple extension of current year funding levels, and it goes through December 4th. And then the one that the Senate passed right before they left for their August recess, a little after the House did, theirs goes until December 11th. And it also is not as quote unquote clean as the House version. And for our purposes, the most notable addition to the basic funding language is language that would delay the implementation of the so-called Uniform Guidance Rule until the date of the CR, the deadline, so December 11th. And we'll talk a little bit about the Uniform Guidance Rule in just a second. It's unclear at this point whether that Senate version has the votes to pass the House, at least on the Republican side. So we don't know really at this point whether the House will simply take up the version that was passed by the Senate and then send it to President Trump for a signature, although the Senate's version was apparently negotiated along with the White House along with Senate leaders. So we'll have to see. If not, then there will need to be some more back and forth to get a continuing resolution that everyone agrees to and votes on and keeps the government open past October 1st. But that all being said, there does seem to be a strong desire on the part of both parties to avoid a government shutdown, particularly heading into the last month before the midterm election dates. And then the other leading story right now in terms of appropriations is the fact that we do not have top line funding levels in the Senate yet. You know, as those of you who follow this process know, funding legislation, like any other legislation that is subject to the filibuster, needs to have bipartisan support in order to move through the Senate. And the leaders of the appropriations committees and their higher ups in the Senate have not come to an agreement on what the funding levels will be for the various each of the 12 bills. And therefore, they've not been able to move forward on that bipartisan basis. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the Senate. Those talks continue, and they'll try to reach, an agreement. And as you can see on the slide here, the parity between defense and non-defense spending is, as it has been for quite some time, is a big issue, particularly with the very large defense spending request put forward by the Trump administration. As a result of this impasse, there have been no Senate Appropriations Committee markups of any of the 12 appropriations bills. And by comparison, in the House, where you don't need bipartisan support to move things forward, the House Appropriations Committee has approved all 12 of the appropriations bills, and a couple have passed on the floor as well. So those are the things that we're really watching at kind of that 30,000 foot level. In terms of our most important appropriations bill, the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education appropriations bill. We've covered a lot of this material in past webinars, so we won't dwell on it, but here again are some of the particulars about it. One thing that I will mention is the Super SIP program, which we do expect to see again in the FY27 bill once they get things all settled out. And that, of course, is the very large Strengthening Institutions program in lieu of individual Title III minority serving institutions programs. Not only are we expecting to see that again in FY27, we're also still waiting for the FY26 awards to be made through the first year of the Super SIP. And of course, one of the things that we're most focused on, and then there's the information for the Department of Labor, who takes a much bigger cut. And then what is also going on with the National Science Foundation, in particular the ATE program. That program would essentially be cut in the House bill. And of course, like I was just covering, we haven't seen anything in terms of how the Senate bill would treat that program. So just to reiterate where we are in terms of our programs and our priorities in the appropriations process, and we did send out an alert to all of our members regarding this, a few weeks ago towards the beginning of the August recess, because this is a great time for you all to meet with your legislators while they're home in their districts and states. But the Pell Grant shortfall remains our number one priority. It is almost a $17 billion shortfall when you combine a couple of years worth coming into this year that Congress needs to address. We do continue to hear positive signals coming out of the Senate about, once they get to the point that they're actually considering individual bills, that they will address the shortfall and do so in a way that's a multi-year fix rather than a one-year fix, which is what we saw in the House bill. And augmented funding for the SIP program, as the previous slide indicated, there was an increase of $11 million for that program in the House bill. So we'd like to see at least that level of an increase in the Senate's legislation and in a final bill. And then we're also advocating strongly for $10 million increases in both the Strengthening Community College Training Grants program and the NSF ATE program that I was just mentioning, to the levels that you see there, $75 and $85 million respectively. So obviously we have a lot of other programs that we care about, and we do focus on these ones in particular because they're so particular in large part to community colleges for a couple of them, and of course the overall importance of the Pell Grant program to our students and institutions. So we urge you all to continue to be communicating about these priorities. The material, the one-pager and letters that we've written on these priorities are up on the advocacy section of our website. So I encourage you to check that out if you haven't seen them. And the House, for instance, they are still home until next week, and the Senate, they are on their recess until mid-September. So there is still time to catch them while they're home. All right, I just mentioned a second ago that one of the things that's most notable in the Senate continuing resolution is the fact that it blocks implementation of the uniform guidance regulations from going into effect at least until December 11th. We have covered this issue in some detail in past webinars, so I won't go into it too deeply, but just by way of quick recap, I mean, this is a rule that would, government-wide really make a lot of very significant and controversial changes to the grant-making process, for one, and make other changes to just the way that you interact with the federal government. I think since we've last talked in terms of a webinar, AACC has joined the other higher ed organizations in comments expressing a deep concern about many aspects of the proposed rule, and you can see some of them there. Replacing merit review with political oversight. That's a really kind of at the core of these regulations, is much more kind of political control over what grants go out the door. And then, arbitrary grant terminations, making those easier. Of course, we've already seen that, but this would essentially sort of codify what the administration's been doing in some areas in terms of again arbitrarily terminating grants that they view as out of step with their priorities. And then requiring much more paperwork in terms of incurred costs as grantees go along and they spend the money that they've been awarded for their grants. There'll be a lot more required in terms of essentially getting approval at many more places along the way than is required now. And I won't really cover these next couple of slides in any detail. They kind of get into a little bit more detail on some of the things I was just talking about and some of the other aspects of the Uniform Guidance Regulation, including the area of DEI and in an effort to essentially ban disparate impact analysis and in terms of grants and other aspects of the federal government. The one thing I'll mention in a little bit more detail is just over the last um, uh, few days, and in terms of the Department of Education and the NSF has also done this as well. They have each of those agencies, and we expect to see this in more, have introduced their own rules that are that really strongly echo the Uniform Guidance Regulation. So as I mentioned, a second ago, that OMB Uniform Guidance Regulation is government wide, but now what we're seeing, and potentially as a reaction to the fact that there is seems to be some political will to block the implementation of the OMB rule. Now we're seeing individual agencies come out with rules that do some of the same things that the overall OMB rule would do. So again, you can see the list of them there on the slide. Again, you get into this area of giving the department more leeway to terminate grants for the term used in the rule is for convenience. But basically, again, that is terminating grants that they don't see as aligning with their priorities. They also want to move away from publishing grant application notices in the Federal Register and making that all center on grants.gov. The extent to which that would be a change for a lot of you is undetermined. I think a lot of your folks that are writing your grant proposals and looking at those are probably going to grants.gov primarily in the first place. There would be competitive priority given to proposals that limit indirect cost rates. So this is a kind of another tack that the administration is taking to bring down those rates. In this case, somewhat indirectly, but of course, grant applications will be under a lot of pressure to do everything they can to get all the points that they can. So that was built into that as well. States and subgrantees would have to comply with executive orders. That was a new addition. Under current regulations, that's already the case for direct grantees from the department. So this is carrying something over from that provision into the regulations that cover grants to states and their subgrantees. There will be more secretarial discretion over continuation awards. Right now, in current regulations, it's somewhat prescribed in terms of the circumstances under which a grant would not be given a continuation award, and the proposed changes would give the secretary more discretion to not grant a continuation award than exists now. There's general selection criteria are modified as well. And the language that we're seeing that's kind of in this DEI area in terms of this regulation is language that would require grantees to ensure that hiring, compensation, admissions, and promotions are based on merit and high standards. So this would be in addition to the already existing regulation that institutions and grantees must comply with federal civil rights laws as they exist now. So it's a little unclear exactly what this entails. That would not be covered under compliance with the law. So it's a little bit vague. And so that's something that we're also keeping an eye on in terms of this new regulation. But again, this is it's a bit of a strange in terms of procedural environment that we're dealing with here, because we have this proposed rule that from the Department of Education and the NSF that, like I said, echo the overall OMB rule, but the overall OMB rule itself is not finalized. So it's a little strange from both the procedural and the substantive aspects. And I'm going to turn it over to David now, and he's going to talk about Workforce Pell.
Yes, that's the belt and suspenders approach to regulation because we were seeing the overarching uniform guidance rule, and then we were notified that the Edgar the grants NPRM would be coming out with very little advance notice, and it's as if the department is trying to make sure that the priorities that and the policies that Jim just outlined would be put into effect, regardless of what happens in the appropriations process that Jim also described. We'll see how all that turns out later this year. So moving on to Workforce Pell, I'm not going to talk a lot about this. We've covered this in a number of webinars so far that have been dedicated to Workforce Pell. We, of course, were very involved in the regulatory process and the enactment of legislation before that. It's fair to say that the progress that's been made in terms of programs being approved has been a little bit less robust than we might have expected it. Only two programs, one is in Iowa, the other is in Indiana, have been approved by the federal government. Both of them are community colleges. We're happy to see. From all of the signs that we have witnessed, the departments are doing a very careful review of the submissions that have been made by the states because they want to ensure that they have, a program that stands the test of time in terms of quality in programs that they approve. I think most of you are aware of the fact that a lot of the implementation administrative roles for implementing Workforce Pell were pushed down to the states that weren't necessarily thought of that way in the bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which contained the Workforce Pell, specifically the area of documenting that the institutions meet the 70% completion and placement rates. And this is an area that we focused on quite a bit because after the governor, working with the Workforce Board, designates program areas that can meet with approval, the high skills, high wage, or in demand, that the state has the responsibility for, again, acknowledging and affirming that the 70% completion and placement rates are met by the institution. The institutions themselves, as you all know, generally don't have the ability to access the data that would enable them to prove the placement on their own. They're reliant on the states, and the regulations themselves encourage the states to use administrative quote unquote systems for ensuring that the 70% placement rate standard is met. And so as we've talked with campuses about this, we've gathered that in some states, the governor and his deputies have done a good job in enabling institutions to document placement. In other instances, much less so. So we are monitoring this again very carefully. We are interested in hearing from you about any particular challenges that you're facing in this regard and any other areas of getting programs approved at the state level. It's not on the slide, but the states also have the responsibility for approving the articulation, if you will, or the acceptance for in a credit-bearing program for non-credit programs. That's part of the sort of stackability aspect of the Workforce Pell, and again, that's a state role. So as we leave this topic, just know that our focus on this, Dr. Pollard's focus remains intense. We do want to hear from you about any good news or bad news about how your programs are moving forward. And one final thing to say is that just because there hasn't been a bevy of programs that were approved even by today, which is almost 2 full months into the start of the program, we don't necessarily view that as being a bad thing. The Pell Grant Authority for Workforce Programs is permanent. And so if it takes a little bit longer for all the administrative processes to be set up and programs to be structured in ways that enable them to qualify, as eager as our colleges might be, we don't think that that's necessarily a negative thing, and we counsel patience on this regard. Although again, we're very interested in knowing about any challenges that you're facing in getting programs off the ground. We'd like to try to be as helpful as possible. The next item I'm going to address is another regulatory one. It's the Department of Education's call to action. And we know that there has been intense interest in this. We've received a lot of questions about it from our field presidents and state level officials as well. This first slide here just outlines generally the call to action itself and some the dynamics around it. There's no question but that the impetus for the call to action was generated by universities and the desire of the administration to encourage universities to reform and improve a variety of aspects of what they're doing. The language of the call to action, even the line in terms of who it was to whom it was addressed, were university presidents and trustees. However, the letter asking institutions to put on their websites by the end of this calendar year their responses to the 7 questions posed by Secretary McMahon. That request went to all institutional leaders, community colleges, liberal arts colleges, as well as universities. And the administration, we've had a number of conversations with them, and they've made a number of statements. They're quite serious about, at least as far as universities go, about the desire to see some real change in university practice coming out of this, and to have the websites of the institutions reflect those commitments to change. Community colleges are in a little bit of a different position. I mean, first of all, because of the fact that again, the letter itself was directed, at least in terms of some of the nomenclature, to universities, and even some of the areas in which institutions were asked to respond were areas where community colleges really aren't very focused or even engaged at all. So, we've gotten questions from our field about, well, should my institution respond to this? And the first thing to be said is that the administration has stated repeatedly that there are no carrots and no sticks involved with this call to action. So no punishment if you don't put something on your website, no reward if you do. And also, again, the questions that are in the call to action aren't all relevant directly to community colleges. Dr. Pollard has written to institutional CEOs and given them her perspective on the call to action. And our feeling as a national organization is that if you're inclined to put on your website an account in the relevant areas of some of the good things that you're doing that respond to the 7 questions that were posed in the call to action. Jim, do you want to move on to the next slide? You can see on this, these are the areas that the query were made. And again, some of them are relevant to us than others. But we think that our colleges, for the most part, have a great story to tell. And in a number of these areas, certainly affordability, we're first in all the higher education. Outcomes is something that our campuses have been focused on for a very long time. There's nothing new in that. So, for example, if the institution wanted to highlight that would be, from our point of view, quite appropriate. Transparency and merit and admissions. Everybody knows that community colleges are open access institutions that in some cases there's a high school graduation requirement to enroll in certain programs, but basically we retain our open door. And so the issues that are related to selective institutions and the criteria that are used to admit students don't really apply to community colleges. So we think a positive message could be sent on that as well. And then also in the questions, and this is a very, Jim, you just want to go back. That is a very non-community college issue, but it's gotten a lot of attention in recent months. Is the issue of the lack of what's called intellectual pluralism or viewpoint diversity on campuses. And in speaking with campus leaders, my impression is that institutions' faculty very much reflect their local communities. And so the professoriate is in keeping with the local culture and values of an institution service area. And so this too might be something that you would simply want to acknowledge as well in your own institutional response, if you choose to make one. And I do want to emphasize that we believe that for institutions, this is absolutely 100% voluntary. They shouldn't feel under any compulsion or obligation to do so. The administration has stated again a number of times that this is not tied to funding of any kind. And so institutions shouldn't put their response on their websites for that reason. We just think that when you feel that you have a good story to tell, that this is a good opportunity to do so. And if anybody has any specific questions about their campus, they can contact me or my colleagues about it as by way of follow-up. Okay, so the next topic is a regulatory compliance issue. It's one that has been pending for quite some time, and this relates to the institutional reporting that needs to be done under the financial value transparency / gainful employment and the student tuition and transparency system. The reason why there are two abbreviations there is because the FVTGE is a creation of the Biden administration, whereas the stats has been put into place by the Trump administration. However, the two systems are very similar, and the Trump administration has made some minor modifications to the requirements that were in stats, or excuse me, FVT. They're a little bit streamlined. A few data elements have been left out, but for the most part, they're very similar. What we have heard, and we've gotten, the department has made some of this information public, is that many institutions haven't complied with the very voluminous reporting requirements that are included in both of these systems, but particularly the FVTGE. And the department has stated in the announcement that's linked to in this slide is that January 15 is kind of the do or die compliance deadline for campuses. So we hope that all institutions can be in compliance then. There's an earlier deadline for the stats system of October 1 that again the Trump administration is putting into place. From our point of view, institutions have had a lot of problems with complying in part because of all the data that we've been asked for, but also because the Biden administration in particular didn't meet its own stated deadlines for getting information back to institutions that would enable them to be fully compliant, particularly on the completer lists that are required for each of the programs that collectively meet a certain enrollment threshold. So from our point of view, there's a reason why not all these data, which are overdue at this point for years 24 and 25, have not been submitted. So we just want to, in our role here as information providers and facilitators, we just want to remind everybody about this requirement. As the slide says, there's a lot of different institutional offices that are involved in this reporting. It is the wave of the future for sure. One of the major driving forces for these data is so that the government can do matches on student earnings, so that the gainful employment and the One Big Beautiful Bill loan provisions can be implemented. And whatever happens in terms of changes in administrations, we have no reason to think that these requirements are going anywhere. The Trump administration basically continued what, again, the Biden administration did. So please pay attention to these deadlines. Okay, moving on. Very important notice of proposed rulemaking that just came out last week on accreditation. We have talked about the accreditation neg-reg process previously. We did a dedicated webinar on the accreditation NPRM a little over a month ago. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but do want people to know that the AACC is going to be submitting comments on behalf of the sector. I think, as everybody is aware, these regulations are extremely far-reaching. They change the accreditation process and what that will be comprised of in new ways. And so that's going to have a direct impact on campuses. The provisions overall, as we have it on this first slide here, we think are in fact going to add cost to overall administration of programs. And of course, we think that that's unfortunate. We do think that there were going to be some new accreditors coming into the system as a result of some of the changes, and perhaps some new providers as large providers as well. So moving on to a couple of the substantive issues that are in the regulations that we will be commenting on. And the first one on this slide here is, as the italics indicate, is a very really a landmark change in policy. It's landmark in terms of the impact it's likely to have, and also because of the role that the federal government will be playing now in directly getting involved in transfer. But essentially, as this bullet outlines, under the regulation, institutions will have to articulate in great detail in advance what their acceptance of credit policies are. They will have to notify students before they make a binding commitment to an institution or register about whether or not their credits are transferring. And then, very significantly, if the credits are rejected, the institution that's rejecting them has to explain, give a written account to the student about why that was done. So we think that from a common rejection of credits in all sorts of places, that's going to be a lot harder to do and a lot rarer as a result of this notice of this rule, assuming it's finalized in the form that it's been proposed. And I didn't mention the fact that we expect this proposed rule to be finalized as it's been proposed. Just going to mention a couple other things. I will mention the second bullet on this page about the need for accreditors to ensure that institutions have policies that promote intellectual diversity and the free exchange of ideas, including, as this reads, measuring faculty and student perceptions. And without necessarily committing us to saying anything in our comments as an association, it's quite likely that we will oppose that. We simply don't think that accreditors should be in the business of calling balls and strikes in terms of the content of programs on our campuses, even though, again, reflecting what I said a minute ago, that we think that the views of our faculty generally reflect the views of the local communities. Just a couple other things in terms of the accreditation NPRM, then I'll turn things over to Catherine. The NPRM does require a more granular, a programmatic focus on student achievement, as well as not just within the course, but also what happens, the experience of students post completion. You can see here these are on the second bullet, the indented one about some of the outcomes that accreditors would now be required to track and assess. We also think it's kind of a sleeper item, but one of the things that we will very likely be commenting on is the fact that the accreditors are going to be required to look at the post-completion education outcomes of students, and we're not exactly sure what that means beyond maybe standardized tests and things, but it's not something that one could easily get into on a substantive basis. And I think I'll just close this little bit on accreditation there and ask Catherine to talk a bit about some of the legislation that's been marked up and that we're looking forward to being taken up in the fall.
Sure. So we wanted to highlight actually quite a bit of legislative activity happening in the Senate at the moment in the higher education's authorizing space. As Jim mentioned at the beginning when he was talking about the appropriations process, obviously senators and members of Congress are not in DC at the moment. They are back in their districts. So the topics that we're going to cover are not necessarily live at the minute, but they are things that could help inform any conversations that you have, particularly if you have any senators who sit on the Help Committee or senators in general that you're meeting with. So first, we wanted to cover something that happened in July that was actually very exciting from our perspective. The Senate Help Committee had a very productive bipartisan markup of a slate of bills, including two pieces of higher education legislation in particular that we want to note, and another that actually came from the committee during the markup. So the first is the College Transparency Act. You all have heard us talk about this bill a lot. It's been reintroduced a number of times. It's had long-standing bipartisan support, and we've endorsed it for several Congresses now. And this is the bill that would overturn the current ban on student-level data being collected by the Department of Education and would finally allow our federal data to capture all community college students, including those who don't receive Title IV, by creating a student-level data network with a number of privacy and security features that we think are very important as well. Again, this is strongly bipartisan, bicameral, and we were very excited to see that it was approved by the committee with near unanimous support. There was one member who did not vote in favor of it, and her issue with the bill was actually not with the bill itself. It was a process-related issue that she wanted to use some leverage to advance another piece of legislation later. So about as positive as a markup for this bill as you could hope for. A little bit about all three of these, but one of the things with this bill that's an interesting consideration is that the longtime sponsor of the bill is Senator Bill Cassidy, who obviously will not be returning to the Senate next year. So the fact that this was such a positive markup, we're hoping really encourages momentum in this area for the rest of this Congress, but also if needed and probably will be needed into next Congress as well when we look at reintroduction. Another bill that we've endorsed for several Congresses now that received a favorable markup was the RISE Act. This is a bill that's aimed at supporting students with disabilities in higher education, and it would essentially allow them to use whatever verification they had submitted to get accommodations from high school in a post-secondary setting instead of having to get new documentation that can often be prohibitively expensive for students. So we see that as a really common sense solution to help those students. And then the last one that was somewhat interesting is there was a piece of legislation that came out of the committee that would limit many of the program transfers from the Department of Education to the Department of Labor. Not all, and not all of the program transfers to other agencies as well. But the one of note for this group is the transfer of the Office of Post-Secondary Education to DOL. So that includes institutional aid programs and others. That was also put forth by this committee. That last one in particular, but all three of these have a very murky path forward in the entire Senate, but then also in the House. But I think right now, in August, when your members are home, if you have members on the Help Committee or you have members in the Senate more generally, just saying that the College Transparency Act is something we strongly support and we're excited to see that markup for, that the RISE Act is something we support and we're excited to see it favorably reported, and then continuing to talk about, some challenges or concerns or whatever that you might have about some of these program transfers as they come up. That's information the Senate is very interested in hearing. So this markup that we had in July, I think was sort of the low-hanging fruit for that committee. The bills that were strongly bipartisan or that the measures that they felt they could confidently get across that body with very little discussion or debate. That means that there are still a few pieces of legislation that Chair Cassidy is interested in advancing that he's less sure of, and those have been kicked down the road to a markup in September. So for that markup, we're anticipating it will include the No Aid for Ghost Students Act, which is sponsored by Senator Moody from Florida, who's on the committee. Um, that bill would essentially codify what the department is doing in the identity verification protocol they've implemented for the FAFSA. There are some concerns about how exactly this is going to be implemented and what limits it might have on secretarial authority in this space. The version in the House that was approved by the House Education and Workforce Committee earlier this year, I think is a little bit more, has some features that are of more concern to different groups in that area, whereas this one is a lot cleaner. Again, Senator Cassidy has said specifically that he intends to bring this up at a markup in September, so that's one we're looking towards. And then another one that is likely to be on that docket is some legislation around simplifying financial aid offers and standardizing them for students. There's a few pieces of legislation that are in this area. Some of them are partisan, some of them are bipartisan. I think this is one where there's a lot of pride of ownership on different versions of this type of legislation. The one that AACC has endorsed is the Senate Help Committee's legislation that they authored themselves, called the Improving Financial Aid Offers for Students Act. This is the one that we think is the best step forward for improving how we're communicating information on costs to students while still maintaining the flexibility that we need to ensure that it's applicable to the student, to the program, and to the institution. And then some other areas where we expect that they might be interested in putting forth some legislation are on loan counseling and then also on net price calculators and disclosures. And then one other big piece of authorizing news that's outside of higher education specifically is that somehow Congress has still not yet fully reauthorized the Farm Bill, which is crazy. It used to be a must-pass piece of legislation, and that has apparently gone by the wayside. But there has been some progress for reauthorizing certain sections of the Farm Bill. And the one we really want folks to focus their attention on is the idea of new money for community college agricultural and renewable resources programs. This is something we've been working on for a few years now, trying to get into a reauthorization of the Farm Bill. And we've had a lot of success in that area. Members, chairs, and ranking members on both sides of the aisle, when both parties have had the gavel, have included language to deliver that sort of support for community colleges in their reauthorization proposals. Right now is no exception. We were really excited to see that in August, the Senate Ag Committee released text that included almost word for word the language of a bill that we have endorsed called the Community College Agricultural Advancement Act that would authorize capacity building grants for our agricultural renewable resources programs. Unfortunately, there was a markup schedule for that bill that was pulled down due to some larger challenges. Essentially, the Republicans on the committee didn't have enough members present to be able to push that forward. So we're hopeful that when that is put back on the schedule before the committee in September, that this language will clear. And then earlier this year, the full House passed their version of a Farm Bill reauthorization that did include language in this area. It was a little less focused on capacity building and more focused on work-based learning. But either way, I think we're very, very excited with the momentum building for new support for our colleges in the Farm Bill. We'll see if Congress can kind of get it together and get this across the finish line at some point. But want to thank so many of our colleges in rural states in particular, and rural communities, and then also those who've done a lot of distinct lobbying on the importance of their agricultural programs. And again, this is another one that if your senator sits on the Senate Ag Committee, might be worth mentioning if you meet with them during the recess. I'll turn it back to David.
Yes, no legislative update would be complete without mentioning the tax repel grant, which we're still focused on. And as I mentioned earlier in webinars, we don't expect to see this enacted this Congress. In fact, we're unlikely to see in any action of major significance outside of the appropriations bill for the rest of this session, but we are still cultivating support for the Tax-Free Pell Grant Act, which is very targeted and very important to our lowest income students. So that concludes our formal presentation. Here are a couple of items looking forward. We're going to do a webinar on September 10, as you can see, where we're going to highlight the priorities that we're going to be asking people who are coming to DC to participate in our Advocates in Action meeting. The webinar, though, is open to anybody who wants to see in some detail what our fall agenda is looking forward. And we do encourage all of you to subscribe to our weekly government relations newsletter that just hits the major things that we're working on and thinking about. And some of it's taken from the CC Day or Community College Daily. More of it is written purposely for this. It's got a little bit more of an insider's perspective than what we publish daily to all of our members. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, our audience, to see if you can you have anything that you want us to try to answer for you.
So the first question we have a couple of questions related to the accreditation regulations, and the first one is: will the credit acceptance provisions apply to 2-year to 4-year transfer of credits?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why we're so excited about it. And so, yes, it will apply to our institutions. It'll apply to our institutions in terms of, the students who move on or transfer to another institution after leaving our doors. It also will apply to community colleges. It should be emphasized, and listeners know that community colleges enroll a lot of students who have previous academic credit as well. And so the requirements about developing detailed policies for the evaluation of transfer credit are going to have to be developed by our institutions as well as the 4-year colleges. It'll have, less of a burden on our institutions, but we are also all implicated in that new policy.
And then first, I'm going to ask my colleague, Catherine, can you put the link for the subscription to the Washington Watch weekly into the chat there? I'm afraid if I try it, I'll end the webinar prematurely. So the other question about the accreditation regulations probably with a far murkier answer is: how are institutions supposed to go about essentially setting the baseline for measuring intellectual diversity on their campuses in accordance with the new standards or if not standards, the new ways that accreditors are going to be needing to pay attention to this under the rules.
It's not just murky, it's clear as mud. So we don't know. I mean, this is going to have to be articulated, defined by the accreditors. These are accreditation entities, procedures the department will be imposing on accreditors. It will then, cascade down to our campuses. So we really just don't know now. And of course, as I mentioned, we're going to oppose this in it being included in the final rule. Our comments on the proposed one will say that we think that this is a bad idea because it is. This is not speaking in completely official capacity because our official statement will be included in our comments. But I think it's fair to say that we think that this is just extraordinarily difficult to implement, if not impossible. And so we're hopeful that the department rethinks this, even though I didn't go into a lot of comment on it earlier, but is that because these accreditation proposed rules were the product of a consensus in the NEGREG process that gives the regulation that's been published a greater force, and there's less of an expectation because of the consensus that was reached earlier, less of an expectation that the rule will be changed significantly as it's brought to final rule. But we think this is just a highly problematic proposal. And let me just mention, because it was on the slide, but I didn't talk about in the interest of time, is that the another thing that requirement that would be imposed on accreditors as proposed that we will likely in our formal comments take issue with is the one that says that accreditors should ensure that institutions are, for public institutions, are following First Amendment requirements. And that's we just think that it's a role that accreditation agencies are not well suited to. Public institutions know they have to conform to the First Amendment, and our comments in general will emphasize the primacy of the quality assessment role of accreditation rather than some things that are less central to that role.
Question and actually kind of point of information about the FBT GE reporting situation. This question is from someone whose college was reported as having that data missing, but then they contacted NSLDS, and the person said that NSLDS had a system glitch that was showing schools hadn't submitted everything, but she confirmed that we had. And the question is, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah.
I would say, yeah, please, Catherine.
Yeah, well, I'm going to let David speak, I think, to the larger issue. But if you actually are comfortable sending some of that information to us, we can try to elevate that on our end to some folks over at the Office of Federal Student Aid and others. But I will say there's also a bit of a lag in when they pulled those. So depending on when you submitted, it might be the lag. And then it could also be something that is appropriate to raise at the office hours session that FSA is hosting. But David, I'll let you weigh in on some of the larger issues.
Yeah, this was to be a last minute addition to the webinar slides, but the Department of Education is having, and as Catherine just mentioned, office hours session on these requirements on the 10th of September. So we encourage you to tune into that and for more information on this. And certainly you want to document any contact that you've had with the department where you were told that your information has been submitted. The electronic announcement on this was a little bit vague, probably deliberately vague about what type of sanction might be imposed for non-compliance with those requirements. I will tell you that we heard directly from high-level people in the Department of Education who were urging us to, in turn, urge our members to submit these data.
And correct me if I'm wrong, colleagues, I don't know that we've heard kind of more generally from other places that there were system glitches that were causing institutions to be shown to be lacking data, but we'll certainly have our ears open to see if that is a more widespread type of issue.
Yeah, and I mean, we've heard for a little bit that there have been lags with NSLDS updating in different places, both on the reporting side, but also on repayment and a bunch of other things. So again, if that's something you're comfortable sharing, I think that's information the department would appreciate. A high level of people actually at the department would appreciate hearing, and we can help make that connection.
Next question is about the Department of Education general administrative regulations that we talked about a few minutes ago. What is the best strategy to advocate or voice concerns over these proposed changes? Speaking with congressional members, at what point is the decision being made and by which entity? So I think the most immediate thing that you can do as an institution, and we will certainly be doing this at the association level, if at the very least, along with our fellow higher ed associations, is submitting comments in the process. So this is a proposed rule that just came out this week, and that started off the 30-day comment period, which, if I recall correctly, goes to the 23rd of September.
Yep.
So look for more information from us about that. And then the other part of the question really raises an interesting issue because, as we talked about, there is language in the continuing resolution that would at least delay implementation of the overall OMB rule until December 11th. It's yet to be seen whether there will be language further delaying or blocking that rule in final funding legislation. And then the other question that would be related to this and more specific to these Department of Education regulations is, will that, if so, would that language potentially be broadened to also block or delay, at least delay implementation of these kind of mini OMB guidance regulations that are, popping up agency by agency? That is one thing that we just don't know yet because this is pretty new. And I think we may have a question. Chat? Oh, it's just someone's notes, I think. So we do have a couple more minutes. If anyone has a question yet remaining and they want to type it into the chat or to the Q&A box, we have a couple more minutes. And if not, we will. We can close it out. All right, seeing no more questions at this point, David, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jim. And just thanks everybody for participating. Nothing to add. We'll see many of you here in DC at Advocates in Action in a few weeks. We're doing again a webinar on September 10th on our priorities, and just wish everybody a happy Labor Day weekend and a good start to the new academic year. Be well, everyone.